Okay, so the question for option 1, again, is explain the idea of conscience as covered in the unit. Compare and contrast Thomas' understanding and use of conscience regarding Henry VIII's desire for divorce with Cardinal Wolsey's. Provide evidence from the scene to support your statements. So for this one, let's see, where were we? I have these notes that I've been adding as we've been reviewing. So, the first thing you should always do is define your terms. So the vocabulary word that's in this question is conscience. So what is conscience? The classic catechism definition is it's a judgment of reason whereby the human person recognizes the moral quality of a concrete act. You could also add to that the moral quality of a concrete act that you're either going to perform, are performing, or have performed. The conscience doesn't. We usually experience it a lot when we have that sense of guilt. But ideally, if you have a well-formed conscience, it should be working throughout the process of doing an action. From that little video we watched, come on. Father Cuddy, his definition was, he said, conscience is the application of knowledge to a particular act prior, during, and after the act. So that's kind of a nice definition. What I liked about this one is he says it's an application of knowledge. So what this tells us is the conscience needs to be ordered to the truth, or at least the truth as you understand it. Your conscience can be wrong. That would be an erroneous conscience, and you're only guilty if your conscience doesn't know the right thing, if you were just being lazy and didn't try to find out the truth. There's a whole bunch of vocab words that you can add in there from the conscience lesson. I don't have them on the slide, but so in the scene, the question asks you to compare and contrast Wolsey and More. So Wolsey, he's mad because Thomas More opposed him in the King's Council, and he calls More's conscience a horrible moral squint, and he says, why can't you just look at the facts head on? Why do you have to bring your conscience into it? What Wolsey's position is, he wants the church, the church property. He wants to take church property. He sees it to kind of pressure the Pope into annulling the marriage between Henry and Catherine, but the Pope had already granted a dispensation to marry her in the first place. And what's interesting is Wolsey's reason. He actually has a legitimate and rational reason for this. He wants to prevent dynastic war, because if Henry doesn't have a throne and they don't have an heir, it can, they'll start fighting, and he wants to avoid that. So ultimately, what Wolsey is doing is he's making like a utilitarian argument. He's looking at what are the consequences of not having an heir, and he thinks that's worse than seizing church land and messing with the Pope and all of that. And then at that very last scene, he asks More, would you put your private conscience ahead of your public duty? So in this scene, the question of conscience is, for Thomas More is, do I follow what I truly believe is right? Or do I kind of bracket that, and kind of use the marriage as like a means to an end? So Thomas More, the first thing he says is just ask the Pope. He won't support taking church land, but for More, it's not their place, to grant an annulment. So he says, if you want it, you got to just ask the Pope. So he won't support taking the church land because it's not their place. And you also see the primacy of conscience for St. Thomas More, and this is also something that's important in Catholic theology. So in response to Wolsey's question, More says, when a statesman forsakes his own private conscience for public duty, they send their country by short order into chaos. And so for More, he he trusts his conscience. He knows what's right and wrong. And he's trying to get Woolsey to see that, you can't do wrong actions and expect something good to come out of it. And so, in this whole statement, it's actually really applicable to kind of American government and the way Americans think about a lot of stuff. So Woolsey wants him to kind of bracket his conscience, but Moore won't do it. And some of the Catholic theology that would apply here, I have some quotes from the Catechism. So ultimately our conscience should be ordered to what's truly objectively good, not just like doing things as a means to an end. But in the Catechism, it states, when he listens to his conscience, the prudent man can hear God speaking. That's one of the reasons why for Thomas More, he can't oppose his conscience, because your conscience is where you're alone face to face with God. That's why the conscience is part of the subjective aspect of morality, because nobody knows what's in your heart, right? And so for More to violate his conscience would ultimately be a violation of his faith and his relationship with God. That's why he takes it so seriously. Another quote from the Catechism: man has the right to act in conscience and in freedom so as to personally make moral decisions. He must not be forced to act contrary to his conscience, nor must he be prevented from acting according to his conscience, especially in religious matters. So Moore's perspective is also recognized by the church. And then it says here, a human being must always obey the judgment of his conscience. If he were to deliberately act against it, he would condemn himself. So again, this shows that in Catholic moral thought, you need to always follow your conscience. Your conscience can be wrong, but as long as you act in good faith, you won't be guilty of a sin. And of course, Moore knows all this because he's a lawyer. He's written works of theology. So yeah, so that's for the first question. Any questions about any of that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let me pause this and we'll go to the next one. So this question is on conscience too. It asks you to explain the relationship between law, freedom, and conscience. Is covered in the unit, and discuss Thomas' understanding of conscience regarding his refusal to affirm the act of supremacy and oath of succession. So, whoops. All right. So in this question, the first part, explain the relationship between law, freedom, and conscience. So first, freedom or freedom of the will is the power rooted in reason and will to act or not act, and so to perform deliberate actions on one's own responsibility. Freedom attains perfection when it's directed toward the sovereign God. So this is one of the powers of the soul. It's one of the things that makes us like God, and it's our human dignity is grounded in our freedom. It's one of the one of the kind of definitive aspects of human nature. So you could also freedom of movement also applies here. So freedom of movement can be curtailed if a person is physically prevented from moving somehow, for example, being tied up, held down, or like in Thomas More's case, locked in prison. So one of the things they try to do to manipulate Moore is they lock him in jail and take all of the assets to try to force him to deny his conscience and take the oath. So they can't really take away his freedom of will, because remember, your conscience is interior. So they try to influence him by taking away his freedom of movement. And then there's a quote. This is from that scene. I'm not sure if it was in the movie version, but in the play, this is Thomas More. He says, "It's most material. For refusing to swear, my goods are forfeited and I'm condemned to life imprisonment. You cannot lawfully harm me further. But if you were right in supposing," there we go, "I had reasons for refusing and right again in supposing my reasons were treasonable, the law would let you cut off my head." So even though they've taken away Thomas More's freedom, he thinks ultimately that the law will protect him. that shows you the problem with legal positivism. Is legal positivism is great if you have good people writing the laws and enforcing the laws, but in Moore's case, that didn't happen. Freedom from the law would be the ability to choose freely without experiencing moral strain of a commanding authority. So one of the things about the law is it's not just like a suggestion, it's morally binding. And if you don't follow it, either you're going to be arrested, or even if no one knows, you're still going to have to deal with the guilt of your judgment of conscience. So ordinarily in Catholic thought, we see the law as a good thing, because it helps to form the conscience and guides our freedom toward the good. Because remember, we believe the reason why we have freedom is to choose the good. So in Moore's case, the law in question is unjust, so it's not morally binding. So we're morally obligated to follow the law, but remember what St. Thomas Aquinas said, if the law isn't just, it's not a law at all. And we saw that in Martin Luther King when he talked about the segregation laws. We saw that in Antigone when she said Creon's law was unjust. Despite that, he still doesn't want to publicly act the traitor, so he stays silent, believing that ultimately the law is on his side. So conscience, we defined it in the last slide, but a major point of tension in the play is the law, which should order the conscience to what's good, but it's commanding Moore to do something that violates his conscience. And this is that great quote from the scene where Norfolk says, "Oh, confound all this. I'm not a scholar. Master Cromwell never tires of pointing out. And frankly, I don't know whether the marriage is lawful or not, but damn it, Thomas, look at those names. You know those men. Can't you do what I did and come along with us for fellowship?" So ultimately, like, that's kind of like a rationalization. He's like, just everyone else signed it. Just sign the thing. And Moore replies, "And when we stand before God and you are sent to paradise for doing according to your conscience, and I'm damned for not doing according to mine, will you come with me for fellowship?" And so what Thomas More is saying here is, if Norfolk truly believes that he did the right thing, then he'll go to heaven for signing the act. But Thomas More knows the act is wrong. So if he signs it, he would go to hell. And so Moore is saying, no, I can't, I'm not going to violate my conscience. And again, it's really important for Moore he's not just being stubborn. For Moore, the conscience truly is where he stands face to face with God. And this shows you, this is where those levels of happiness come into play. Thomas More has lost everything. He's lost his family. He's lost his property. He's in jail. But for Moore, his relationship with God is so important that he's not going to give that up. And so he can go to jail and he can suffer all all these sufferings, because for him, he has that level 4 unity with God. And he believes that ultimately, like, the law will save him. He's in contact with the perfect lawgiver and perfect justice. But the problem for Moore, it's almost naive, that he's not in a perfect world. He's in a fallen world. Let's see. It also says discuss the conscience, specifically in terms of the oath of supremacy. So just to remind you, what was the act of supremacy and oath of oath of supremacy, I think. So Anne Boleyn's children are heirs. You know what? I don't even know if you have to go in that much detail. I guess you could add this. But it also said that Henry's the head of the church. But Moore says that Parliament can't make Henry head of the church, so it violates Moore's conscience. It also said the marriage to Catherine was null. But Moore believes that Parliament can't grant a divorce. So it's the second and third points that violate Moore's conscience in the law. So Moore is charged, what is he actually charged with denying Henry's title because he doesn't take the oath. So Moore says he doesn't deny it, but Cromwell says silence is a denial. And Moore says the maxim of the law is silence gives consent. Ultimately, they only convict Moore on false evidence. After his sentence, he finally speaks his mind and explains why he can't sign the oath. So Moore dies with a clean conscience. And for Moore, the conscience is identical with his very self and his relationship with God. And that's what I was saying about the level 4 happiness. He can give up his life because he's already in union with perfect truth, beauty, justice, and being. So even though, because he knows at the end he only gives up his earthly life, right? He was totally confident that he was going to go to heaven. All right. So our next question, come on. Oh, wait. Oh, I have that quote from Margaret where she visits him in jail, and he's like, she says, but be reasonable. Haven't you done enough? And he says, this isn't a matter of reason. It's a matter of love. His love for God. Okay. So these next two questions, we don't have to watch the scene because we just watched it. They're both from the trial. So short, let's see. Explain the concept of law as covered in the unit. Discuss the law at issue in the scene. It's the oath to the act of succession and supremacy. Evaluate whether the law meets the criteria of a just law and Thomas' response to the accusation against him. Provide evidence from the scene to support your statements. So we don't have to watch that scene again. We just saw it. All right. So first of all, again, defining our terms, what is a law? A law is an ordinance of reason promulgated by one in authority for the common good. So all those bold terms, remember for St. Thomas Aquinas, the definition of law is sort of like the categorical imperative of Kant. It kind of is like a test. So if a law doesn't meet those 4 requirements, Thomas would say it's not a law, and if that's true, you're not morally bound to obey an unjust law. So, what's the specific law in question? We just went over this. It's the act of supremacy and the oath of, you can just put that, act of supremacy and succession. I think it's actually it's the oath of supremacy and act of succession. So again, what did the law stipulate? The ambulance children are the heirs. The problem, Moore would have signed it if that's all it said. But the problem here is it makes Henry the head of the church. And Parliament can't do that. It's not within their legal scope or moral scope. And making the marriage to Catherine null, again, that's not within the proper authority of Parliament. So if the law is true, it must be reasonable. And it's not reasonable because it contradicts both the divine law, the positive law, and the ecclesial law. So the reason it contradicts divine law is, he kind of says it here. And this is a quote, the indictment is grounded in an act of Parliament which is repugnant to the divine law. It contradicts the Magna Carta and the oath of coronation. And so Moore says that the act contradicts divine law because Jesus is the one who picked out the hierarchy of the church. So when they make Henry head of the church, they're contradicting a command of Jesus Christ himself. It contradicts the positive law because it contradicts the Magna Carta and oath of coronation, which both gave the church kind of immunity from positive law. And then it also contradicts the ecclesial law of the church because the rules governing an annulment, that would be church law. It's a form of human law made by the leaders of the church. And when they annul the marriage, they're going against church law because we don't have the power to do that. That's something the church does. And this time, apparently, the Pope was able to do that. But now, if you need an annulment, there's annulment tribunals in every diocese. So you just call up your pastor if you get divorced and you think you could get your marriage annulled. You just call them up and they'll put you and get you started on that. Yeah. All right. So it's not reasonable on 3 grounds because it's contradictory. It was promulgated. That's not a problem. Authority, as we were saying, Moore would argue that Parliament doesn't have the authority to be using their power in this way. So here's the paraphrase. Jesus made Peter the head of the church. That's divine law from Matthew 16. The authority to grant annulment is church law, which is a form of a positive law. And the teaching that marriage is indissoluble, that's also divine law. Jesus teaches that. It's actually not Matthew 6. It's Matthew, it could be in Matthew 6 too, but it's also in Matthew 19. And then finally, all laws should be for the common good. And we could argue that this law wasn't for the common good because it's kind of a personal beef between Henry and More. I think you could argue two ways with this one. Wolsey tried to argue it was for the common good because he's like, look, we have to prevent dynastic war. But at the very end, when Thomas More, after he's convicted, and he speaks his mind finally, he gives his rationale for why he thinks the law is unjust and he wouldn't sign to it. And then he says, but nevertheless, he said, that's not what you convicted me of. You were mad because I wouldn't bend the knee to the marriage. And so in that quote, it shows that ultimately Thomas More is arguing that it's not about the law. It's about this, they just wanted him to bend the knee. It's about King Henry's pride. And so if that's true, then this isn't for the common good at all. Right. So, any questions on that? All right. So the final option, explain the different types of law covered in the unit and the relationship between them. Discuss which types of law Thomas references in the scene. And again, this is that trial scene we just watched. And now he seems to understand the relationship between the law regarding the oath to the act of succession supremacy and the other laws mentioned provide evidence. So we could skip this because we just watched it. So this is just a little chart that kind of shows you how the laws fit in a hierarchy. And so I don't know if saying saying the law, the divine law it's not that it's more important than human laws. It's more foundational. And remember, the principle of non-contradiction is one of the rules of logic. So if you have laws contradicting themselves, that means they're not rational. So, and from a Catholic perspective, law needs to be rational. So where you have contradictions, that creates a problem. So you have the eternal law is just the mind of God and how he orders everything in creation. We have physical laws, the laws for matter. So we have the divine moral law, that's the natural law, and there's remember the synderesis, the first principle, do good, avoid evil. And then you have the positive moral law. That's laws that God gave us in the Ten Commandments and Jesus' teachings. Then you have the moral law. These are laws for human wills. You have the human ecclesial law. So these are the laws that govern the church. And then you have the civil positive laws. So the act of suppression, act of succession, that's an example of a human positive law. So this shows you how they kind of subsist in each other. I'm not going to read through that right now, but you could look at that later. So for this question, what types of law are mentioned in the scene? So if you like law or you're going to be a lawyer, you could do this question. You have the civil or positive law. This is a law that's been formally laid down, or positive law made by an external sign, either by God or humans. So an example from the scene is the act of supremacy and oath of succession. What's ecclesial law? It's an ordinance issued by legitimate authority within the Catholic Church. The legislatures for the entire church are the Roman pontiff alone, or the Pope through the Roman Curia, or an ecumenical council together with the Pope, the bishops for their individual dioceses, or conferences of bishops for territories under their jurisdiction. and the major superiors of institutes for the perfection of their members according to their respective constitutions. So it's basically like the magisterium. Every baptized person, even if one's not a professed Catholic, is subject to the ecclesial laws except in such cases as indicated in the law. So the law regarding the annulment, that's an ecclesial law, because that's a law that is under the legitimate authority of the church. The divine law is the law of God, where God is the direct origin, the law that comes to us from God's revelation history, begun with the Ten Commandments, the prophets, and brought to fulfillment in Christ, and elucidated by the magisterium. And there are actually two examples. First, the authority of the Pope is granted by Christ himself. Moore mentions that, and this is where it is in Scripture. So that's actually divine law. And then the indissolubility of marriage is also established by Christ himself. This isn't something the church made up. It's something Jesus taught us. So these are the three types of law you see in this scene. Moore also mentions the natural law at least once that I noticed, but no, actually there is another scene where he mentions it a couple times, but it's not in this scene, so you can leave it out. So for this one, how does Moore see the relationship? He understands that divine and ecclesial law are more fundamental than British positive law. So he also notes that the king and parliament have usurped their authority with the oath and the act. So how do they relate to the oath of succession and act of supremacy? This is where Moore kind of says his opinion on that. He says, I will discharge my mind concerning the indictment, my indictment, the king's title. The indictment is grounded in an act of parliament which is directly repugnant to the law of God and his holy church, the supreme government of which no temporal person may by any law presume to take upon himself. This is granted by the mouth of our Savior Christ himself to St. Peter and to the bishops of Rome whilst he lived and was personally present here on earth. It is therefore insufficient in law to charge any Christian to obey it. And more to this, the immunity of the church is promised in both the Magna Carta and the king's own coronation oath. So there's where Moore talks about how what they've done through British positive law is contradicting the divine law and the ecclesial law, so it's not reasonable, you know. And he says it's not reasonable, I don't have to obey it. So yeah, again, he's really clear in his conscience. What did I do here? Was that it? Maybe I didn't have another slide. I don't know. Do I not have another slide up? Maybe that's the end of it. I couldn't remember if I had another slide. Yeah, that is the end. Okay. So, just to review, you answer one of those questions. You have the notes from the slide. You could bring a page of handwritten notes. Just one side. They need to be handwritten, and you'll turn them in. But hopefully that will help you with maybe writing a quote you can use for support, or if you're need help with definitions, you can put those on your piece of paper. And then remember, next class, another thing to remember is that the assignment for the reading, you know how we were taking notes, not the reading, the notes, where is it? Whoop, here. The Man for All Seasons notes will also be due after the test. So there's just the notes you took, but there's also some questions, analysis questions to answer, and that will actually help you study for the test as well. It's almost time to go. I don't know why it's being so slow, but make sure you either answer those before the test, or if you finish the test early, you have 90 minutes, so I imagine many people will finish it early. Make sure those questions get answered, because we'll turn them in next class when you take the test. And then we'll be moving on to what's perhaps the most important unit, looking at how Catholics view the moral act, the parts of the moral act, and yeah. Any questions about the test? No. All right.